Hey there, how are you?
Hey, who are you?
Well, I'm not Scott Luton today. Today
What?
I'm Karin Bursa. Yeah, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, likewise. It's good to have you. It's kind of nice to have this change of pace, don't you think? I mean, I feel like Corinne, we've been pretty stellar together, so I'm pretty excited about this.
And humble. We're always
Yeah,
humble too.
always
So
that. Yeah.
yeah, well, our community should know that Scott's off working hard, getting the word out in another forum today. So I got the opportunity to join Greg White for one of my favorite conversations of the year. So I feel
Yes.
like I kind of won the lottery.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad that you were volunteered to lead this thing because I'm I'm more of a color commentary person, as you know. So you can do the play-by-play. You can be the quarterback, and
You
I'll
should have
just I'll
told me
just
that earlier.
I'll
I
just
did
run
not.
every third play or something like that.
Oh, okay. See, I thought you were the quarterback, but hey, I'll take the ball anytime I get it. So that's all good. On that topic, then, today is National Be a Millionaire Day.
Yes.
Is there ever a bad day to be a millionaire?
I don't know. I've never been a millionaire.
Well, so the proverbial question would be, right? I know
Of
that there
course.
are a number of charities that are close to your heart, but once you did some things in those areas, what would Greg White do to really splurge with that windfall on National Millionaire Day?
Landscaping. I know.
Landscaping.
I know it's not exciting. It's it's not anywhere it's not anywhere near $1 million or whatever 400,000, whatever would be left over after charities, but I mean that's the thing that I immediately comes to mind is landscaping. I love my yard, I love my backyard, I want my front yard, and I think Mike Griswold, when we bring him in, oh my gosh, we gave him up. Well,
Yeah,
we know what this day is, don't
we
we?
do. Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't yell at me for that, so I really appreciate it. So, Mike will really appreciate this. I want my front yard and backyard to look like Augusta National,
Oh,
and just be kind of an oasis. Not a lot of hardscape, a lot of plants, paths, green grass areas, and we've done some preparatory work. We cut down 91 trees in our backyard, most of which were giant pines threatening to crush our house
holy cow.
at the next major
91. That's
storm.
a lot of
It is a lot. I
trees
didn't
to
even
come
know there were
down.
that many back there. But anyway, so it's all prepared for that. So we've even saved money on that. That's more money to donate. So what about you, Corinne? $1 million drops in your lap.
Yeah, $1 million drops in my lap. Well, of course, charities are one of the first things that would come to mind. One dream trip that I've always wanted to do, and we have never even attempted to plan, is I would love to go island hopping in the Greek Isles.
Oh,
Take the
wow.
family and just spend like a month and do a lot of the small isles, do some sailing, some scuba diving, and just really explore a lot of the local culture that's off the beaten path. I think that would be a blast.
Well, Scott has already said my answer is the worst
I
ever.
saw that. So Scott is not far from the live stream.
I did not think that it could get worse until you come up with something like that, but that is awesome. Yeah, that's a fantastic thing. We'll ask Mike when we get him in here. So let's clue folks in. So
Let's do it.
today we're going to talk to Mike Griswold, our usual monthly call with Mike, Supply Chain Today and Tomorrow. And just yesterday, right, Corinne?
It was just yesterday, the big announcement.
Yep. Yeah, the Gartner Supply Chain Top 25 came out. If you haven't already gotten it, that's great. If you haven't seen the flurry of posts all over social media about it, first of all, none of those matter because we're talking to the creme de la creme, the master of ceremonies, the coordinator, the manager, the final authority. I'm saying that so he gets a lot of phone calls from people who were in it and not in it.
I think he's getting those already, but we'll have to ask.
Of the Gartner Supply Chain Top 25, Mike Griswold. So without further ado, should we just bring him in, Karin?
Give me 2 minutes and let me just welcome a couple of folks that are joining us today,
yeah,
if that's
of course.
okay. Because once we get started on this topic,
that's why you run this thing.
it's going to be a crazy roll, because it is something that I know you and I are both really passionate about, and we look forward to seeing this list every year. And the Gartner team puts in a tremendous amount of work in
last
the
year.
process.
It's funny to say this.
Let me
when
say
we
hello.
did this last year, there was a lot of conversation. So let's see what people have to say so far.
So let me just do a couple of quick shout outs. Esther, thanks for joining today from Canada. We are so glad you are here. And Ashmir, I apologize if I'm not getting that right, but we are glad you're with us from Sierra Leone.
Wow.
Now that's nice to hear from. And we've also got Senthil, who's with us from Singapore. So we've got a really global audience today. And of course, Rhonda Zimmerman, PhD, is joining us. Rhonda, I did your relaxation techniques just the other day. So thanks for some of those tips. And we are glad the gang's all here. Let's bring in Mike Griswold with Gartner. If you guys are not familiar with Gartner, you've got to add this name and this point of view to your list. And let's go ahead and swish in Mike, and then we'll get started. And there he is. Mike, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
Good. Top 25 hotline, please hold. Top 25 hotline, please hold. Top 25 hotline, please hold. Hi, guys. Thanks, Greg. I didn't need any more calls, Greg, so I appreciate that.
I was going to say, I'm sure you appreciate Greg just cranking up the call volume for you.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Well, we have excluded anyone who's not in the top 25 from this broadcast, so you're safe. It's a safe space, Mike.
I would,
absolutely.
I'll date myself if I say the phone's ringing off the hook. So I'll just say there's been a lot of electronic communication in the last 24 hours.
I bet there has. I bet there were some surprises. I mean, and in a second we'll talk about how you do that. But
sure.
But can we pose the question to Mike, Karin? Mike. You get $1 million. It just drops in your lap. What's your splurge?
Well, I'm glad you went with landscaping, because my answer can't be worse than that. So, Scott, thank you for teeing that up.
I know.
I'm a giver. What can I say?
And I appreciate that. I think this will probably not surprise you, Greg. I would spend, excuse me, probably 15, 20 grand, and I would put in a really, really nice golf simulator. It's got the TrackMan, it's got, the net, the screen, shot, ball flight, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I would probably have to spend some money on putting a different room in the house. But yeah, it would be something around that. I mean, I like the trip idea. That looks like fun. I mean, if your backyard ends up with an amen corner, give me a call. I'll definitely come by and see that. But
definitely,
it would be
definitely going to look like the 12th green. So that's the idea. At least in one corner of the yard.
Yeah.
So
perfect.
Well, you know what? I was going to talk sports for a few minutes and talk about the NBA finals and hear what's going on. But I got to tell you, I want to hear about the Gartner Top 25.
Sure.
I mean, there is a lot of work, a lot of effort, Mike, that goes into this.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, just give us a quick level set. What is the top 25? What's the goal of the top 25? And then we'll talk about, some of your key insights from the work that has been done over the past year to determine the new winners.
Sure. It's we're talking about sports. The top 25 is basically a full season. There's a program team, Jim Romano, Kim Ennis, Joe Tennant. Those are the folks behind the scenes that really make this thing work. For me, it's kind of just pulling all that together. But this was year 17 for those folks that have been around. This started with AMR research. We carried it through when we got acquired by Gartner. And it really was designed to do a few things. Early in its journey, it was designed to raise the perspective and raise the profession. Early in our AMR days, we actually wrote a book called Supply Chain Saves the World. I would suggest that actually kind of came true in the last 12 to 18 months. And I think over the last 18 months, the supply chain has been elevated anyway, right, through the work that organizations have done with their supply chain to get through the pandemic. It certainly, as I was, somewhat joking, Greg, it certainly sparks debate. People
Yeah.
want to know kind of where they are and how their
Yep.
peers did. So, that it does certainly do that. But the things that I think are most beneficial that come out of the top 25 are really two things. One, learning from leaders. So what are different companies doing that maybe we can bring into our own organizations, and this cross-pollination of ideas. When we talk about kind of the diversity within the top 25, one of the things that becomes pretty clear is the diverseness of industries. You've got retail, you've got
Yep.
CP, you've got life sciences, you've got high tech, and all of those industries have solved similar problems in different ways, right? Everyone deals with inventory. The way life sciences deal with inventory might be different than the way a consumer products company does, and we can learn from that. So the
Mhm.
cross pollination of ideas, I think, is one of the big takeaways that I hope people take away from the top 25. It's a very structured methodology. Half of the methodology is on financial performance. So we have 3 financial metrics: return on physical assets, inventory turns, and revenue growth. We have an ESG component where we look with data from third parties that we partner with. That is 50%, and then the other 50% is what we refer to as a community perspective, a peer voting 25% of the methodology, and 25% the Gartner analyst perspective. We look at and evaluate about 300 companies every year. There's some inclusion criteria: need to be publicly traded, need to basically have a supply chain, you need to have 50% of your revenue coming from physical products.
Mhm.
And that's, there is a ton of work in terms of gathering the financials, gathering the ESG data, running the peer vote and the analyst vote, and putting it all together, and then generating the list. And that's what culminates with all. I would say it's about 9 months worth of work. So we did the reveal. We will start talking about 2022 in July.
In
Uh,
July.
in
Wow.
July.
And so what I want people to hear is that is a good 9 months worth of work. It is
It is.
delivering a huge project. And I imagine there's a sense of excitement and a sense of relief. But as you just mentioned with the hotline, it probably cranks off a whole nother cycle of additional work and follow-up and discussion, and some recommendations from the insights that Gartner gets as a part of doing this analysis.
Yeah, the biggest, and I'll kind of relate it to my coaching experience, is, we talk about, in coaching, I talk to the girls about outcomes, right? We're doing these activities to achieve an outcome. And I have that same discussion with companies around the top 25, right? You should be working on initiatives and activities to generate a better performing supply chain as an outcome. If those things happen, then chances are good things will happen to you as part of the top 25, especially if you're talking about the things that you're doing and sharing it with the community. There's a reason that 50% of the methodology is a community perspective, because we want people to share. We want people to tell their story so that others can learn from them. That whole cross-pollination piece. If it was just a financial exercise, the list would look frankly very different, but it's not. It's important that we get both of those perspectives. And the reason I share that is we have a lot more productive conversations with companies, regardless of where they landed in the list or off the list in terms of the top 25, is here's where you have opportunity to make your supply chain better. The conversations, frankly, that don't go well are with companies that say, I'll just pick a number. I don't even know who's there, right? Let's say you land at number 30, right? And the first words out of your mouth is, how do I get to 20? That's not, those aren't the types of conversations that are helpful. The
Yeah.
types of conversations are, hey, you're at 30. Here's some areas of opportunity for you to think about within the macro construct of your supply chain. Those are the types of discussions that we find people find a lot more helpful than getting fixated on a particular number.
That's
Yep.
that's a
Right.
really fine line, Mike, but that's an important distinction, right? Is don't aim for the number, right? Aim for goodness. It's like I
Right.
talked, of course, I've been in startups and I talk to them all the time. And they want to talk, so many want to talk about their exit strategy, right? Exit is not a strategy. Exit is an occurrence. It's an outcome.
Yeah.
But your strategy of building a sound and solid company, just like building a sound and solid supply chain, will give you the outcome that you deserve and likely want. So don't
Exactly.
focus on so much on that number. Focus on building good foundational enterprise, and you'll get there. And exactly, not how do I get to 20, but what do I need to improve in my supply chain is the most important thing, because there's so many companies out there, Mike, that will never be in the top 25 because of the criteria. There's a whole,
Right.
there are
Right.
thousands of
Right.
companies that just can't get there, but they can always improve their supply chain.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly
Yep.
right.
Well, and so I think this year is especially important for a couple of reasons. So Mike, clearly, we're starting to emerge from a global pandemic that supply chain took center stage. And so some of the improvements and investments that have been made for years leading up to that event helped companies to respond more effectively. Maybe those who have kicked the can down the road didn't perform the way some of their competitors did. Did you change any of the criteria for this 2021 list as a result of the pandemic, or did you focus in on any additional areas, or is it the exact same criteria you've used in the past couple of years?
So great question. We recognize the impact that the pandemic was going to have, particularly on the financials. So we've always had in the past a weighted approach to return on physical assets and a weighted approach to revenue. A 3-year weighted average for both of those. Yes, 50% is the most current year, but it includes, the other 50% is from the previous 2 years. So, we did see some impact, particularly in some industries on the revenue side. But again, revenue is just one of the metrics that we use. I would say from that perspective, really no change. We did make 2, I'll call them subtle changes on the ESG side, though. So we have 3, let's call them 3 categories of the ESG methodology where people can earn points. There's as an area on commitment, and in that area, since we launched ESG in 2016. The only way to demonstrate commitment was signing the UN Global Compact. And we recognize a lot of people do that. A lot of people don't sign it for really good reasons. It could be that there's a specific piece of language in that they're not comfortable with, so they're not going to sign it. And as time has evolved, we started to realize that there are other ways that organizations are demonstrating commitment in general to this idea of ESG. So this year we added data from an organization called sciencebasedtargets.org. So, and what we did is we said, hey, if an organization has committed to setting science-based targets, we would recognize that as a demonstration of commitment. Through sciencebasedtarget.org, you can do 2 things. You can commit to set targets. So we'll have science-based targets by 2023, just as an example. And you can also actually commit to what those targets are. So we basically said anyone that has committed to set targets or has actually committed targets, we will recognize that as commitment.
Yep.
And we had a number of companies who had not been getting points in that commitment category get a point for that. The other change we made, which is probably more significant, although it didn't have as much impact as maybe I thought it might earlier in the process, is we recognize the growing importance of ESG. We hear about it all the time in the community. It's part of the reason through community feedback that it got added to the methodology in 2016. It's based on a 10-point scale, so you can get 0 points all the way up to 10 points. What we put in place in 2021 was a company had to have an ESG score greater than 0 in order to get a ranking. So we had in 2020 a number of companies that got rankings that had an ESG score of 0. Now, let me be clear. It doesn't mean that those people hate the planet. What it means is the work that those companies are doing from an ESG perspective aren't captured by us in the methodology. And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to branch out on the commitment side. It's one of the reasons that I'm always looking for feedback on, are there other partners that we should be working with on the ESG side? So those were the two, I would say, tweaks that went into effect for this period.
Yep. And Greg, I know from your perspective, right? We've both been in the technology side of supply chain and improving supply chain performance for a number of years. I took a lot of personal pride when one of our customers made it onto the top 25. What's your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you feel like you're a part of it, right?
I know.
I think it doesn't matter if you're the technology company, the trucking company, the 3PL, or even just one of their suppliers of goods or parts or materials. It's a great feeling to know that you're part of it. And the truth is, with this ESG component, you are a part of it, because ESG goes to a lot of things, right? Fair trade, environmental impact, all of those sorts of things, human rights, all of those things that are impacted. And to know that you're contributing to that kind of goodness, as well as to the improvement of a supply chain in its outcomes and in its performance, that's a great feeling to have. Loved it. I've always loved it.
Yep. I get excited about seeing this list every year, Mike. So, and I love that you guys do some industry derivative lists as well, because I think that gives some recognition in specific verticals on what's going on and how they're contributing or battling, a specific set of challenges that may exist there. So kudos to you and the team for getting this out and making the announcement yesterday.
Yeah, let me just highlight a couple of statements here from Azalea. I like that Mike is speaking to being intentional with that better performance and not counting on it just happening, but being strategic. So I think that's that's to the point we made before, that point of distinction in terms of making, not reaching for a number, reaching for a performance level, reaching for an improvement, reaching for an outcome. And then there's another one I think that's really important for all of us to acknowledge here. And that's
Robert
Tompkins. Clearly a good soul, Robert Tompkins. Landscaping is not a bad idea. The right landscape can feel like a vacation every day. So not a horrible answer. Okay, I'm just saying, people.
I'm glad someone came to your rescue.
Yes.
Thank you, Robert.
No kidding. There's a few folks that aren't going to be seeing landscaping for much longer, like poor Rhonda, where it's probably already 100 degrees, over 100 degrees, because it's May, almost June in Phoenix. So what she'll be watching is landscaping withering away, but not supply chains.
Nice. Nice attempt to move us back to the topic of the top 25 there. Not bad. Hey,
that
Mike,
was not selfish. That was completely relevant to the conversation.
Mike, let's talk about some of your key takeaways, right? So obviously, we said this is the 17th year for the top 25 list. The process has been refined over time. What I love is that there are some objective measures. It's not just a least cost, high volume model, right? The peer rankings, the ESG contributors, et cetera. But when you look at this list, what are a couple of your takeaways? Well, first of all, maybe you should tell us who's on the list in case our audience hasn't seen what that
Sure.
list looks like.
Sure. Why don't I go through the top
Let
10?
me do an advanced graphic while you do that, Mike. There you go.
Oh,
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
you're
There you
so
go.
high tech.
So one of the things
Only the top production quality here at Supply Chain
Excellent.
Now, Mike.
What happens when Scott's not around?
That's
I
right.
know.
So one of the things I didn't cover was, we have, if you were on the webinar or you downloaded the report, what you'll notice is we have this classification that we call masters.
Yep.
So these are companies that have had a top 5 composite score 7 of the last 10 years. So this is these companies we recognize as having long-term sustained supply chain excellence. So those 5 masters: Amazon, Apple, McDonald's, P&G, and Unilever. So those 5 are kind of outside of the population based on their performance in being in that masters category. Now, one point of clarification is, as we do the evaluation, right, and we rank everyone's composite score, those 5 companies are in that pool. So if for whatever reason one of those companies were to fall out of the top 5, that becomes one check mark against them losing their master's criteria. So I often, if I go back to the sports metaphors, the masters are not, we're not hanging their jerseys in the rafters. They're not retired. They need to perform at a top 5 level every year, or at least 7 to 10 consecutive years, in order to stay in that category. So
in
that
coaching vernacular, this is your starting 5, but
this
they could
is our
find themselves on the bench if they let their game slip.
Exactly. If they decide to not play defense, then yes, they will be on the bench if they were to play for me.
Yeah.
So that's the masters category. And then our top 10, Cisco at number 1, second year in a row for them. Colgate-Palmolive at 2, J&J at 3, Schneider at 4, Nestle at 5. Top 5 stayed exactly the same as last year. So if I round out the top 10, Intel at 6, Pepsi at 7, Walmart at 8, L'Oreal at 9, and Alibaba at 10. So that's the top 10. Just a couple of observations. I mentioned Cisco, number 1, 2 years in a row. Going back to kind of the visibility that this can get. We announced this on Wednesday, so yesterday, and either an earnings call that was yesterday afternoon or an earnings call that was this morning, the CFO at Cisco referenced the Gartner Supply Chain Top 25 and Cisco's performance in that. So it definitely gets visibility. We talked about last year we had 3 life sciences companies in the list. This year we have 4. That's the most we've ever had. J&J at 3, but we also had Pfizer at 21, who's a newcomer. Bristol Myers Squibb at 24, and AbbVie rose at number 11. So life science is well represented. Schneider, if I think about the message I gave a little bit earlier about this blending of the community content or the community perspective and the financials, I think it was 5 years ago, Schneider was number 17. In that relatively short period of time, they've gone from 17 to number 4, 2 years in a row. Yes, it's by certainly supply chain performance plays a key role in that, and they've got a really, really strong supply chain. But I would also argue that they do a great job, one of the best jobs in the top 25, of doing those things around why we have the top 25, cross-pollinating ideas, sharing with other industries, being very open around the things that they're doing with their supply chain. So they're a really good example of someone that embraces the entire spirit of the top 25, not just the financial performance, but also, I think in some ways these companies have a responsibility to the rest of the supply chain community to where they can, right? I'm not asking these companies to give away the secret sauce, but where they can, I think these companies have an obligation to share some of the things they've learned. Intel's another great story. Between them and Cisco, they're the only two companies that have been in the top 10 for 10 straight years. That in and of itself is a huge accomplishment. Walmart in the top 10 for the first time in a number of years. L'Oreal moved up into the top 10. So, we've got a well-balanced list of industries. I think you've got big companies, you've got small companies, you've got companies that are, global in nature. You've got companies that are more regional and local. So the other message is there's lots of different ways to run really, really good supply chains. And that's what we hope one of the things we hope people will take away from the top 25 is lots of companies have lots of different supply chains, and there's lots of different ways to run really good supply chains.
Yeah, I think interesting. To me, the big revelation here, among all of those things, the big revelation here is an earnings call where the words supply chain are uttered in any measure. I mean, if that doesn't tell you how the world has changed, I don't know what does.
Yeah, by the CFO.
By the CFO, right, who knows what supply chain is, presumably because he said it, which is also a revelation. I mean, I think other than considering it a cost center or cost saving mechanism, we haven't had that kind of esteem where an earnings call matters and where something like this, a ranking of supply chain excellence, really matters enough to tell your entire shareholder base about, not your own company, not just analysts, right? Not just your fellow executives, but to tell your entire shareholder base about that's truly impressive.
One of the things, Greg, we get asked all the time, I get we're in different industries. I get they're different companies, and I get that they've had different approaches to the supply chain. But are there things that kind of knit them together, right? Is there a DNA strand that runs in all of these companies? And I'm gonna piggyback on what you just said, Greg, about kind of the role and the definition of the supply chain. When you look at most, if not all of these companies, you're going to find a couple of things around the supply chain. One, you're going to find a very, very clear definition of what the supply chain is. And oftentimes, the definition of the top 25 companies in the Masters is broader. It has, demand planning. It has customer service. It has innovation. It has elements of new product introduction. It might have procurement. What you won't hear is someone say, my supply chain is distribution centers and trucks, right? You will not hear that from these. Well, let me phrase it. You will not hear that as a full stop, right? This is my supply chain. It's just trucks and sheds. The other thing that these companies have done very, very well is they've aligned the supply chain strategy, its operating model, with the company's operating model and the company strategy. To the point where for some of these companies, if you were to ask them, they would tell you, you would hear words like enabler for growth, enabler for innovation. We've weaponized our supply chain. Our supply chain is a competitive weapon. Those are the types of ways that these 30 companies, this is how they describe their supply chain, in a very enabling, proactive, differentiating capability within their organization. To your point, Greg, it's not seen as something, that well, let me rephrase that. If you went back in time, people would have said, I have a supply chain because I have to. And it's kind of a cost center, and that's where the story stopped. I think today it's a little bit different. Yeah, you have to have a supply chain for sure. So that part of the answer is still the same. However, how you use your supply chain to create things like or support things like innovation and support growth and support entry into new markets and entry into delivering new products and services. Those are all enabled by a world-class supply chain. And to your point earlier, Karin, we saw that during the pandemic. We saw organizations who had been out in front with investments in their supply chain and were able to pivot into completely different business products to support the pandemic,
Yeah.
and also organizations that were positioned, let's say, to go direct to consumer, and were able to kind of take that road as well. So the role of the supply chain in these companies is very well defined, and it's very broadly defined. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that makes them successful.
Yeah, those are all just great points. So a couple of things. You mentioned this list of 30, and we're talking about the Gartner top 25. Reason is, as Mike said, there are 5 companies that are recognized as masters. So they have had very, very strong performance, right, Mike? In top 10 for the last 5 of the last 7 years?
Top
I mean,
5.
Top 5.
Yeah, basically, I think the way that it works, Mike,
They
and you can
graduate.
clarify, these would always be the top 5. So to be fair to some other great organizations, you've basically called them the icons, and then, or the masters, right? And then the rest vie for 25 spots. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I love the fact that they can slip, right? They have to renew every year, if you will.
Yes.
They have to continue that level of performance. So Mike, again, those 5 companies are Amazon, Apple, McDonald's, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So certainly supply chains that have shown significant leadership over a number of years in operations, all very global in nature, and technically all operate a wide variety of supply chains within their business as they bring different products to market in various regions around the world as well. So go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was just going to give Robert an opportunity to share his real gifts with us here. I mean, this is a great paraphrase of a lot of what Mike said, isn't it? I mean, sharing best practices will generally only help organizations, including potentially your own suppliers, becoming better. Everything is more interconnected than it ever has been, and great ideas can come from anywhere. And that's essentially, Mike, was precisely what you said, and in screen size form, and that is share with those who could value the knowledge that you have. As obviously, as you said, don't give away the keys of the kingdom. But there's a lot that can be shared that benefits the entire supply chain. You want to talk about the butterfly effect in actualization. The supply chain is that. Somebody doesn't even have to be in your industry to impact your supply chain. They could be taking up the transportation that you need to move your goods. If you're in the automotive business, they could be in the healthcare business and still affecting your supply chain by taking up capacity. So if you can help them be more efficient, more effective, more sharing and giving themselves, then that can benefit the entire supply chain, as we have seen with container shortage, Suez Canal blockage, port congestion, and things like that. A lot of that problem, and the reason that problem continues to evade us, is because these companies continue to bang their head against the wall, trying to jam their goods into the Port of Long Beach or the Port of LA, rather than having some agility that someone with the knowledge in the top 5 or top 25 could give them to say, hey, have you ever considered Houston or Charleston or Savannah as a port? That could help your supply chain a lot. I mean, it's things like that seem simple, but often need to be shared from the real experts. So I'm glad that you're promoting that. I'm also glad to see that your masters and your top 25 are good at sharing that sort of thing, both within and without their own supply chains.
Yeah, it's an important, I think, element for us, Greg, as part of the methodology. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted this to be more than just a financial exercise, right? Because there's not a whole lot you can learn. I don't want to say you can't learn anything, but it's hard to learn from just looking at someone's, return on physical assets or looking at their inventory turns. It's how do they put that in the context of their own business, and how do they share that? I think the big message, particularly because my background, Greg, is all retail, and we tend, although I think we've gotten a lot better at this, we tended to have a mindset of, if it wasn't invented in retail, by another retailer that it really wouldn't work for us. And I think we've gotten a lot better about looking at other industries for examples around things like inventory management. One that's near and dear to my heart is, we're now moving S&OP and S&OE into retail.
Right.
And a lot of that is based on, things that consumer products companies have known for 30 years when it comes to S&OP and S&OE. It's that translation and that contextualization. So, what companies have to be open to is doing a little bit of work that says, if I'm a retailer and I'm going to listen to, let's say, I want to listen to AbbVie around how they bring products to market, right? I want to hear that. I need to be able to do a little bit of work on my end to contextualize that for retail. And that's where I think we're getting better as retailers in doing that. And I think in general, other industries as well can certainly, still have room to improve in that area as well. And just not thinking about, hey, the only things that will ever work in my industry are things that came from my industry. I think if you were to canvas this list of 30 companies, they all probably have an example of something they took from another industry, recontextualized it for their industry, and are having success with it.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Innovation comes from lots of different places, right? And thinking about problem solving or how to harness a new opportunity is a critical piece of that. Mike, you've been doing this now as an analyst for a number of years. When you look at this 2021 list, were there any surprises for you? Or did you go, oh, yeah, that's pretty much what I expected? Anything unusual, any surprise that's worth noting here?
A couple of things. I mean, I felt going into this that, we would have a little bit more momentum with our life sciences companies. Now, I didn't expect, this to be half. And I was glad we went from 3 to 4. Because I think the life sciences supply chains over the last 12 to 18 months have really been tested for sure. And I think by most accounts have responded pretty well to those challenges. I expected, and unfortunately it came true for a number of retailers, especially in the soft lines, fashion and apparel space, where the revenue component was tough. I mean, deemed non-essential, limited, store hours, limited number of shoppers, all of those types of things.
Anything you wear below the waist, nobody was buying.
Right.
They're only seen in video from here up, right?
And couple that with many of them were a little bit slower to get into the e-commerce space than maybe they should have been.
Right.
Yes.
So you had kind of this convergence of, let's call them negative scenarios that definitely impacted people. I think, the fact that, we didn't see any change at the top, I think speaks to, at the top 5 at least, I think speaks to the fact that those organizations have been continually positioning and investing in the supply chain, and that was reflected in the fact that they stayed where they were last year. If you look at their numbers, though, their numbers were all better, right? Composite score higher than last year. Most of their financial metrics higher than last year. So that idea of sustained performance, I think is what drove that. So I would say, Karin, to your question, not a whole lot of surprises, and unfortunately, some of the things that we thought might happen, particularly in some industry segments, they did come to fruition.
Interesting. When we were joking earlier about these are some of the world's largest companies, right? You've got to be publicly held. There is a mix of revenue size. There's a mix of industry in here. There are some companies that are both manufacturers and retailers.
Sure.
Right.
in the mix as well. We're going to see that more and more, right? More direct consumer. And I think those that weren't before the pandemic now have some competency in these areas and will continue to grow and expand in their direct consumer offers as well. Tell us about that angle, Mike, about what you're seeing.
Sure. I mean, we identified each year we identify 3 macro trends that we kind of pull from the process. So whether it's company briefings, materials that companies provide us to educate us around their supply chain, and one of the trends that we highlighted was this idea of customer-driven business transformation. And it's really an evolution of what we talked about last year, which is kind of this idea to enable business model transformation, because we saw a lot of that coming through the pandemic, people having to evolve their business model. And that, I think, took on a new flavor in 2020 and into 2021 for this list, in that the customer was more and more at the center of that transformation. Whether it was we have now formalized the voice of the customer. We had a number of companies talk to us about and share insights from their chief customer officer, a title we wouldn't have had 2 years ago. Now we're hearing more and more of a chief customer officer whose job is to really play back for the business the experience the customer is having. And whether that's an end user, an end customer, say for a retailer, or whether it's a retailer who's the actual customer from, say, a consumer products company. But getting all those perspectives, not only from an experience perspective, but also from a requirements perspective. You mentioned that direct to consumer piece. That definitely was probably I would say one of the biggest drivers of transformation was this direct to consumer aspect. And whether it was for folks maybe like Walmart, who'd been doing it well for a while, it's now, volume is 60, 70, 80% more than they're used to. How do you deal with that? To maybe a consumer products company who, is used to shipping pallets and now needs to ship individual bottles of shampoo. Yep. So all of those types of insights that you're hearing from, the quote unquote voice of the customer, the ability to recognize the impact that has on your operating model and then your supply chain model, that became really important this year. And I think when you look at these companies, they have, I think their finger on the pulse of their consumer, however they define them, and they're able to link that requirement to satisfy the customer. They're able to link that back into supply chain requirements, and then they're able to deliver those. That to me is the big link that these companies are making relative to understanding what their end consumer needs and how does the supply chain enable that.
Yep. And I love that. And Greg, I know you do too, because you're a big advocate for forecasting and anticipating what the customer wants, right? Not how the item performs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the greatest myths of supply chain. And frankly, it's our Achilles heel, is forecasting items. In 1903, when most forecasting techniques that we use today were invented, or they were all invented by that date, it made perfect sense because we didn't have the data to forecast a customer. And now we do have the data to predict what we're going to do as shoppers, and we need to have technology certainly reflect that. But I think also we have to recognize that, and this is another thing I say often, the consumer is the beginning and the end of the supply chain, full stop. The nothing happens until somebody wants something. You can argue all of the chicken and egg questions around, well, what if we made a green sweater? The fact is, if you didn't have a green sweater, they would still buy your yellow sweater, right? Do we want to try to appeal to a different market, blah, blah, blah? But I think of the supply chain as a caveman, cave person, cave dweller, right? I had a tomato, Karin had an arrowhead. She thought that was a really tasty tomato. She gave me an arrowhead for it. Beginning of supply chain, right?
Right.
And from that point on, it has only gotten more complex. And in some cases, to Mike's point, less focused on the consumer. And when we simplify it down, simplify supply chain down to all we're trying to do is get the goods to whoever will consume them. That doesn't necessarily mean a shopper, by the way. You know, other companies consume goods from companies that manufacture them as well to make their own products. So we have to recognize that what we're trying to forecast and who we're trying to satisfy is definitely the consumer. Yes.
All right, Mike, what you see just happened there is I opened Pandora's box.
You lit the candle.
Yeah,
I lit the fuse.
But I want to come back to kind of the top 25 list, right? So there are a couple of other lists that will come out from Gartner that have this theme. What should we be looking for? What other lists are on the horizon?
Yeah, and you teed that up earlier. So all of this published yesterday. There's also a PowerPoint deck that published that has the listings of companies that were 26 to 50, and then it has all of the industry cuts. So, and what we've done is we've taken that population of 300 companies and basically said, okay, here are the top 10 consumer products companies, here are the top 10 retailers, and we've done that, you know, for other industries. So that's available as well. That provides, you know, and in some ways it opens up the door for more questions than we have answers for right now. But what we will do with that over the next 3 months is we will write research notes around each of those cuts. So, you know, we have an analyst who'll write about, you know, the top 10 retailers, and someone will write about the top 10 consumer products companies. We will also be doing and looking at the data from a European perspective. So and that is the top 15 companies that are based in Europe. So obviously some of this you will see again in terms of some of these companies because they are European based. And then there's also companies that maybe are outside the top 25 that are European based, though, that will be in that list. We do the same thing for Asia Pacific. All of those will be out over the next probably 3 months. The goal is to get them all out before our first symposium, which is in September in London.
Yep. And we'll be face to face, right? So if anybody out there is interested, that is going to take place in London at the O2, and will be a face-to-face event. So you have the opportunity to actually engage in 3D if you're ready.
October in Orlando.
In Orlando, yep. Absolutely. Now, Mike, you guys have also worked on a top 25 list for university programs.
Correct.
When does that come out? Because that's one to watch as well. With somebody who's got a kid in college, and I keep pushing several of his friends and him as well in the direction of supply chain. That's a list I've been watching for the last probably 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. So because of some of the things that happen behind the scenes in terms of gathering the data for that, and because we're looking at colleges and universities and the methodology is built around that, and some of the changes don't necessarily manifest themselves, you know, year to year, that report is an every other year report.
Oh, okay.
So there will be a 2022 version of that. But we have analysts that obviously author that report, cover that topic, still keep in touch with the colleges and universities, can still speak to that. But because of kind of the timing and the how long it takes some of these things to actually iterate and move, it's an every other year report.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for that clarification. And for our listeners, Clay did put a link to the Gartner Top 25 in the show notes, so be sure to see that as well. Hey, Mike, any final thoughts before we Can
we pose Mike a question before we cut him loose?
Sure.
We've got a couple. I think he addressed this largely, the common threads considered the IV that kept companies alive and thriving through the pandemic. You already spoke to one, and I think Azalea picked that up, and that is that those companies that were very agile, obviously, that helped them to thrive. You had 3 primary findings. One was the customer-driven business organization. We talked about purpose-driven organizations. Yeah. By the way, I love the people, planet, and purpose component of purpose-driven organizations. And then, of course, something stunningly we've only sort of talked about cursorily today, and that is digital-first supply chains.
Yeah,
right?
true.
So moving to digital has been critical, as we've been saying all along. And Mike, you've said it and heard it. If you built your house on sand and somehow you managed to survive this catastrophe, don't do it again, right? And that catastrophe, the sand that your supply chain is built on, is spelled EXCEL, Excel. So if or MANUAL, manual.
Right.
So there's obviously a lot of those findings. Was there anything else, Mike, that just jumps out at you that help these companies survive or thrive, even if they weren't top 30?
Yeah, I think it's they have a focus and I would say even a mastery of some of the things that we would consider the non-sexy part of the supply chain. So they have really good S&OP processes that they were able to leverage during the pandemic.
Hey, I think S&OP is sexy, so I'm just going to.
Okay.
Is that what the S&OP is for?
Yeah, that's what the S stands for. They have
that tells you a lot about me right there. So
they have a really good set of metrics, end-to-end metrics, something like our hierarchy of metrics. They understand supply chain segmentation. They understand cost to serve and cost optimization. So those are all things that, for some organizations are relatively new and, might be the new shiny object. For these top 25 companies and masters, they've built some really good capabilities, some pretty mature capabilities in those areas that don't necessarily get a lot of publicity, maybe except with Karin around S&OP. But you need to do those really, really well if you have any hope of doing some of these other things that we talked about.
Yeah, good call. Doing the dirty work is important. I mean, this is a dirty jobs industry, and there's no shame in that. Micro has single-handedly elevated dirty jobs to prime time, right? So
exactly.
He definitely has. All right. Well, so thanks so much, Mike Griswold with Gartner, for being here with us. Hot off the press is the Gartner 2021 Top 25 Supply Chains, as well as 5 Masters. So you can take a look at that information. It is in the show notes. And Mike, we are so glad you were able to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. So, Greg, what do you think?
Well, I think you did a great job of trying to keep this thing really, really organized, despite my best efforts. So apologies there. Azalea had a couple of really poignant questions there. This one also, is there a responsibility or a duty that exists in the top 25 seat of moving respective industries forward or being a representative to the smaller businesses and startups that have potential? Mike spoke to that a little bit, but further to that, a lot of these big public companies have corporate VCs. Mm-hmm. They work with centers of innovation that nurture companies in their industry and also nurture startups that could help the industry. They have all kinds of outlets that can help to advance. And as Mike said, that's an important part of the obligation that I think a lot of these companies see. So that was another great question. But yeah, thank you for driving. That was fantastic.
So the other thing that I would mention that I was surprised that Mike didn't mention, but I know he's so focused on the top 25 right now, is Gartner also has some awards that they call the Chainovator Awards. And these Chainovator Awards are more targeted at mid-sized businesses. So recognizing that the companies that are typically making this top 25 ranking are some of the world's largest brands, but that there is a lot of excellence that's happening in mid-market companies as well. So look for that Chainovator Award and the announcements they make typically around their symposium events as well. So there's always been some interesting approaches that come from those businesses. Yeah.
Well, they have so many ways of highlighting and elevating companies and giving you criteria on which to evaluate companies if you're a supply chain practitioner looking for solutions, or if you are a supply chain service or technology organization looking to improve your own product or your approach to the marketplace. It's a fantastic confluence of both practitioners and service providers, and they do a good job of making it valuable to each separately and together. So, look, I mean, there's no doubt this is the premier analyst organization in the world. AMR was even before Gartner bought them in terms of supply chain, and having the size of team and funds and everything behind them has really elevated an already outstanding team. Folks, you and I have known for almost 2 decades. So, yeah, I think it's powerful stuff. And you know what I love about, Mike, and of course he mentioned Tom Enright, either pre-show or in the show. I can't even remember now. It's just like you're sitting down at the coffee table with him, right?
I know. He's awesome.
But both of them have been practitioners, and I think it's brilliant to be able to take someone who has been there and done that, to know the practical realities of the industry, and then to start to theorize and philosophize on the industry, rather than have somebody straight out of school or straight out of academia try to relate to something they've never experienced. So
yeah, it is not an academic only approach here, right? You've got to be able to motivate your teams on a global basis to really strive for those performance goals as well. And on that note, Greg White, host of Tequila Sunrise and Supply Chain Now, I want to thank you for letting me join you today. While Scott was away, he gave me lended me his microphone for just an hour or so here. And it was just a lot of fun, and really enjoyed being with you on today's episode of Supply Chain Now to cover the Gartner Top 25.
Yeah, well, likewise. Thank you. It's always good to have an adult in the room when I am here. So I appreciate you guiding and driving us. And of course, thanks to everybody in the crowd. We do this a lot. We have a lot more shows. We have Karin Bursa's show, Tech Talk. If you want to learn about what is sexy in S&OP and other supply chain,
join my yes. Please subscribe to Tech Talk.
PG rated at best. But if you want to learn about supply chain technology, you can do that here. Of course, on Tequila Sunrise, we talk a lot about supply chain tech and investment and the marketplace in general. We've got Supply Chain is Boring, and we're branching out, of course, too. We've got This Week in Business History, Digital Transformers, Dial P for Procurement. You'll see what we did there.
Logistics
if you're a Hitchcock fan,
don't forget Logistics with Purpose as well.
And Supply Chain in Espanol.
Yes.
So we are constantly reaching out. And if there's something you'd like to hear, also let us know. We know that you will. We love our community. You guys are fantastic, and it's always great having you here. So thanks for joining us today. Do you want me to wrap it up, or do you want to wrap it up? Should we do it together?
You can wrap it up.
If we can do it in tandem.
I don't know.
You know where to find us. If you don't know where to find us, find somebody who does. I mean, where have you been? No, supplychainnow.com.
Just bring a friend.
Supplychainnow.com or YouTube or anywhere that you get your podcasts from. As I said, we've got a ton of shows. I'm going to do this myself on behalf of Scott Luton, Karin Bursa, Clay, Amanda, Lori, Allie, Kevin, Enrique, you name them. Natalie, yes.
Joshua.
Kelly, everyone.
Yeah.
On behalf of the entire...
Don't forget the doctor.
Oh my gosh. Chris Barnes, the supply chain doctor. Supply chain is boring. Or is it? On behalf of the entire team, you know what to do. Do good, give forward, and be the change that you want to see in the world. Acknowledge reality, but refuse to be bound by it. And we'll see you soon. We out.